Have you ever noticed how the most innocent childhood memories can become the most terrifying nightmares? Tonight, as the autumn wind whispers through bare branches and rain taps gently against your window, we're diving into something that will twist everything you thought you knew about fairy tales. Close your eyes and let the familiar comfort of those old stories dissolve into something far more sinister. Welcome to Midnight Crime Story, where beloved childhood fables transform into psychological thrillers designed to accompany you into sleep. I'm your narrator for this haunting journey, and over the next hour we'll explore 3 deeply unsettling tales that blur the line between dream and reality, between the stories we tell children and the truths we hide from ourselves. But first, let me ask you something. Do you remember being read to as a child? That warm feeling of safety as someone's voice carried you through magical forests and enchanted kingdoms? Tonight, we're returning to those same forests, but the path has changed. The breadcrumbs have been scattered by darker forces, and the happy endings you remember might have been lies all along. If these psychological horror fables send chills down your spine, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more twisted bedtime stories. And don't worry about falling asleep during these tales. That's exactly what they're designed for. The black screen format with gentle rain sounds will help you drift off, even as your mind grapples with the unsettling imagery we're about to explore. Our first tale begins in a place you know well. Picture the cottage from Hansel and Gretel, but imagine discovering it not as a child lost in the woods, but as an adult returning home after decades away. The gingerbread has crumbled. The candy windows have melted and reformed into something that doesn't quite look like candy anymore. And deep in the forest around it, you can hear children laughing, even though no children live here anymore. The cottage of sweet memories begins now. Dr. Sarah Chen had been driving for 6 hours when she finally saw the turnoff she'd been looking for. The GPS had stopped working 30 miles back, leaving her to navigate by memory down roads that seemed both familiar and wrong. The autumn rain had started as a light drizzle, but now drummed steadily against her windshield, creating patterns that reminded her of something she couldn't quite place. She was a child psychologist, respected in her field, known for her work with traumatic memory recovery. But tonight, she was just a daughter returning to settle her grandmother's estate. The cottage had been in the family for generations, though Sarah hadn't visited since she was 8 years old. Her parents had forbidden it after that summer, and now, 25 years later, she was beginning to remember why. The headlights swept across the familiar gate, its wrought iron twisted into shapes that looked like candy canes in the dancing shadows. She parked and sat for a moment, listening to the rain on the roof, letting the memories surface slowly. Her grandmother had been a baker, famous in the small mountain town for her elaborate gingerbread houses and sugar sculptures. Children would come from miles around to see Grandmother Chen's creations, especially during the holidays when the cottage transformed into something from a fairy tale. But there had been something else about that summer, something that made her parents pack their bags in the middle of the night and drive home in silence. Sarah could almost remember it now, like trying to grasp a smoke with her fingers. There had been other children at the cottage that summer. She remembered playing with them in the forest, their laughter echoing through the trees. But when she tried to picture their faces, all she could see were shadows. The front door key was exactly where her grandmother's lawyer said it would be, hidden inside a ceramic mushroom that had somehow survived decades of mountain weather. As Sarah turned the key, she noticed that her hands were shaking. The door opened with a creak that sounded almost like a sigh, as if the house itself was exhaling after holding its breath for years. Inside, the cottage was smaller than she remembered, but then everything seemed smaller when you returned as an adult. Dust motes danced in the beam of her flashlight, and the air smelled of old sugar and something else. Something organic and slightly sweet. The furniture was covered in white sheets, giving the living room the appearance of a gathering of ghosts. Sarah made her way to the kitchen, where her grandmother had spent most of her time. The massive stone oven dominated one wall, cold and dark now, but still emanating a sense of warmth, as if it remembered all the things it had baked over the years. On the counter, covered by a cloth that had once been white but had yellowed with age, sat something that made Sarah's breath catch in her throat. It was a gingerbread house, perfect in every detail, despite sitting there for who knew how long. The icing hadn't cracked, the candy decorations still gleamed in the flashlight's beam, and tiny gingerbread figures stood in the doorway as if waiting for something. Sarah reached out to touch it, then pulled her hand back. Something about the little house felt wrong, though she couldn't say why. That's when she heard the first giggle. It was soft, barely audible over the rain, but distinctly the sound of a child laughing. Sarah froze, listening intently. The sound came again, from somewhere deeper in the house. She told herself it was just the wind, or maybe an animal that had gotten inside, but as she followed the sound down the narrow hallway toward the bedrooms, the laughter became clearer, more distinctly human. The sound led her to a door she didn't remember from her childhood visits. It was smaller than the other doors, painted in faded pastels with tiny handprints decorating the lower half in what looked like finger paints. When Sarah touched the handle, it was warm, as if someone had been holding it just moments before. The door opened into a room that definitely hadn't existed when she was 8. It was a playroom filled with toys that looked both vintage and somehow timeless. Wooden blocks spelled out words in a language she didn't recognize. Dolls with painted faces sat in a circle around a miniature tea set, their glass eyes seeming to track her movement. And in the center of the room stood another gingerbread house, this one large enough for a child to crawl inside. The laughter was coming from inside the gingerbread house. Sarah knelt down and peered through the candy glass windows. Inside, she could see tiny furniture made of cookies and cake, walls decorated with frosting flowers, and in the very back, barely visible in the shadows, small figures that seemed to be moving. "Hello?" she called softly. "Is there someone in there?" The laughter stopped abruptly, replaced by a silence so complete it felt solid. Then, very quietly, a voice answered from inside the gingerbread house. It was a child's voice, high and sweet, but with something underneath it that made Sarah's skin crawl. "We've been waiting for you to come back," the voice said. "We've been waiting such a long time." Sarah jerked backward, her heart hammering. As she did, more voices joined the first, a chorus of children all speaking in unison. "Come play with us, Sarah. Come inside where it's sweet and warm. Grandmother made this just for us." The rational part of her mind, the part trained in psychology and scientific method, insisted this was impossible. But the child in her, the 8-year-old who had spent that strange summer in this cottage, remembered something her adult mind had buried. She remembered other children, children who had come to visit Grandmother Chen and had never left. She remembered playing with them in the forest, but never seeing them leave. She remembered how her grandmother's eyes would gleam when she watched them play, how she would mutter to herself in the old language while she worked her sugar magic. And she remembered the night she had woken up to find her bed empty except for a gingerbread figure that looked exactly like her, down to the tiny braids in its frosting hair. Her parents had found her the next morning, standing in the kitchen in her nightgown, reaching toward the massive oven with sleepwalking steps. They had packed immediately, her mother crying, and her father shouting at Grandmother Chen in words Sarah didn't understand. They had driven away in the pre-dawn darkness, and Sarah had never seen her grandmother again. Now, as she stared at the gingerbread playhouse and listened to the chorus of children's voices calling her name, she began to understand why. The voices were growing louder, more insistent. "Come play, Sarah. Come be sweet with us." Grandmother's waiting in the oven room. She has something special cooking just for you." Sarah backed toward the door, but as she did, she caught sight of something that made her freeze. On the wall, barely visible in the flashlight's dim beam, were photographs. Dozens of them, all showing children at different periods over the decades. Children playing in the forest. Children helping in the kitchen. Children standing proudly next to elaborate gingerbread creations. And in every single photograph, the children's eyes held the same glassy, distant expression she had seen in the dolls downstairs. The voices from the gingerbread house had stopped calling her name. Instead, they had begun to sing. A lullaby she recognized from her childhood, but with words that were different, darker. "Sleep now, little one, in sugar dreams so deep, where gingerbread children their secrets always keep, the oven's warm and waiting, the frostings sweet and thick. Come join us in our candy house, where time moves slow as brick." As the children sang, Sarah noticed something that made her blood run cold. The gingerbread house was growing larger. Not visibly, not in any way her rational mind could process, but somehow she knew that the miniature door was now big enough for her to crawl through. The candy windows glowed with warm, inviting light, and she could smell the most incredible scent of baking bread and melting chocolate. Her feet began moving toward the house without her conscious decision. Each step felt heavy, dreamlike, as if she were walking through thick honey. The children's voices grew sweeter, more welcoming, and Sarah found herself thinking about how nice it would be to just crawl inside that warm, sweet space and rest. After all, she had been driving for so long, and she was so very tired. Just as her hand reached for the gingerbread door, something sharp jabbed into her palm. She looked down to see that she had been clutching her car keys so tightly that the metal had broken skin. The small pain was enough to break whatever spell had been settling over her, and suddenly she could think clearly again. The gingerbread house was still miniature. The singing had stopped, and in the sudden silence, she could hear something else. Something that made her heart race with terror. Footsteps were coming down the hallway toward the playroom, slow and deliberate. And with each step, she could hear the sound of something being dragged across the wooden floor. Something that scraped and whispered like sugar being poured from a great height. Sarah's breath caught as the footsteps grew closer, accompanied by that terrible scraping sound. She pressed herself against the far wall of the playroom, her flashlight beam dancing wildly as her hands shook. The door handle turned slowly, and she could hear something breathing on the other side, deep and labored, like someone who had been holding their breath for a very long time. The door creaked open, and Grandmother Chen stepped into the room. But it wasn't the grandmother Sarah remembered. This figure was impossibly tall and thin, her once plump frame stretched like taffy. Her hair, which had been silver and neatly pinned, now hung in long, brittle strands that moved as if under water. And her eyes, those kind brown eyes that had watched Sarah play all those years ago, were now milky white and seemed to look through rather than at her. "My sweet granddaughter," the thing that had been Grandmother Chen whispered, her voice like sugar crystals grinding together. "You've come back to me at last. I've kept your place warm in the oven, just as I promised." Behind her, she dragged an enormous rolling pin made of what looked like bone, its surface covered in a sticky, amber-colored substance that caught the flashlight's beam and threw back rainbow reflections. Sarah found her voice, though it came out as barely a whisper. "Grandmother, what happened to you? What happened to the children?" The tall figure smiled, revealing teeth that had been replaced by candy corn, each one perfectly pointed. "Oh, my dear, they're all here. They're all safe and sweet and preserved forever in my special recipe. Would you like to see them?" She gestured toward the gingerbread house, which began to glow from within. Through the candy windows, Sarah could see them now. Dozens of children from across the decades, their forms translucent and shimmering like spun sugar. They pressed against the windows, their faces perfect and unchanging, their eyes holding that same glassy stare from the photographs. "We play together every day," Grandmother Chen continued, her voice taking on a sing-song quality. "We bake and we laugh and we never grow old, never get sick, never leave. It's everything a child could want forever and ever." "You're insane," Sarah breathed, backing toward the window behind her. "Insane?" Grandmother Chen's laugh was like breaking glass. "I'm preserving innocence, my dear. Do you know what happens to children when they grow up? They become bitter and cruel. They forget how to play. They stop believing in magic." Her voice grew harder, more crystalline. "I saved them from all of that. I keep them perfect." Sarah's mind raced, her psychology training kicking in even as terror threatened to overwhelm her. "But they're not alive, Grandmother. They're not really children anymore. Life is overrated," the twisted figure replied, taking a step closer. "Life means pain and disappointment and death. But sweetness? Sweetness is eternal." She raised the bone-rolling pin, and Sarah could see that the amber substance coating it was moving, flowing like thick honey. Sarah's hand found the window latch behind her. The old mechanism was stiff, but adrenaline gave her strength. "The summer I was here," she said, desperately trying to keep her grandmother talking while she worked at the latch. "You tried to put me in the oven. My parents saved me." "Your parents were fools," Grandmother Chen hissed. "They stole you from paradise. Look at what you've become. A doctor who pokes at broken children's minds instead of healing them with sweetness. You could have been perfect, preserved in joy forever." The window finally gave way, and cool mountain air rushed in. But as Sarah prepared to climb through, she heard something that made her freeze. From the gingerbread house came a new voice, smaller and more desperate than the others. "Sarah, help us, please. We're so tired of being sweet." It was a little boy, maybe 6 years old, pressing his translucent face against the candy glass. Behind him, other children were nodding, their perfect faces showing the first cracks Sarah had seen in their sugary facades. "We want to grow up," whispered a girl with pigtails made of licorice. "We want to leave. We want to be real again." Grandmother Chen spun around, her bone-rolling pin raised. "Silence! You are perfect as you are. You don't need to grow up. You don't need to leave." But the children in the gingerbread house were growing louder, more insistent. "Help us, Sarah. Break the house. Break the spell. Let us go." Sarah looked from the window to the gingerbread house to her transformed grandmother. Every instinct screamed at her to flee, to climb through that window and run until she reached her car. But these children had been trapped for decades, some of them for longer than Sarah had been alive. How could she abandon them? "The recipe," she said suddenly, remembering her grandmother's old habits. "You always wrote everything down. Where's the recipe for this spell?" Grandmother Chen's milky eyes narrowed. "Clever girl, but you're too late. The sweetening process has already begun for you. Can't you feel it?" Sarah looked down at her hands and gasped. Her fingertips were beginning to harden, taking on a glossy, caramelized appearance. The sensation was spreading slowly up her arms, and with it came a strange warmth, a sense of contentment that she recognized as deeply wrong. "It doesn't hurt," Grandmother Chen said soothingly. "Soon you'll feel nothing but sweetness. No more pain, no more fear, no more difficult decisions. Just eternal childhood bliss." But Sarah fought against the spreading numbness. She was a psychologist. She understood the mind's ability to create its own prisons, to choose comfortable lies over difficult truths. "No," she said firmly. I choose to grow up. I choose to feel pain and joy and everything in between." She grabbed the gingerbread house with both hands, ignoring how the candy walls burned her transforming skin. "And I choose to let these children grow up too." With all her strength, she lifted the elaborate structure and hurled it against the stone wall. It shattered in an explosion of gingerbread crumbs and melted sugar, and immediately the temperature in the room plummeted. Grandmother Chen screamed, a sound like a tea kettle boiling over, and her stretched form began to collapse in on itself. "What have you done, my children, my perfect, sweet children?" But the translucent figures that had been trapped in the house were changing. No longer glassy-eyed and perfect, they began to look more solid, more real. The little boy who had first called for help looked up at Sarah with eyes that were brown and warm and very much alive. "Thank you," he whispered, and then he and all the other children began to fade, not disappearing but transforming, becoming something Sarah couldn't quite see but could feel in her heart. They were moving on, finally free to continue the growing up that had been stolen from them so long ago. Grandmother Chen was shrinking, her impossible height collapsing as decades of unnatural life left her body. As she diminished, she became more recognizably the woman Sarah remembered, though ancient beyond her years. "I only wanted them to be happy," she whispered as she fell to her knees. "I only wanted to protect them from the cruelty of the world." "I know," Sarah said softly, kneeling beside the frail figure. "But protecting someone from all pain means protecting them from all growth, from all real joy. You kept them from becoming who they were meant to be." Grandmother Chen looked up at Sarah with eyes that were brown again, human again, but filled with the weight of terrible understanding. "What have I done? All those children, all those years." "You can't undo it," Sarah said gently. "But they're free now. They can rest." As dawn began to break through the playroom windows, Grandmother Chen closed her eyes for the last time. Her body crumbled away like old gingerbread, leaving nothing but the faint scent of vanilla and cinnamon. Sarah looked down at her hands. The caramelization had stopped and was beginning to fade, her skin returning to normal as the spell broke. She was still herself, still real, still free to make mistakes and learn from them. She walked through the cottage one last time as the morning sun streamed through the windows. In the kitchen, the perfect gingerbread house on the counter had crumbled to dust. The photographs on the playroom wall showed only empty frames. And in the massive stone oven, she found what she had been looking for: a recipe book, its pages filled with her grandmother's careful handwriting. The final entry was dated the day before Sarah's family had fled all those years ago. It was a recipe for something called eternal sweetness preservation, and beside it, in her grandmother's increasingly erratic handwriting, were the words, "The child, Sarah, resists the mixture. Her parents suspect. Must try harder tomorrow. Cannot let another one escape into the bitter world." Sarah closed the book and added it to the pile of things she would take to the authorities. There would be questions, investigations, families who finally had answers about children who had vanished decades ago. It would be painful and complicated, and there would be no simple endings. But that was what it meant to be human, to choose the difficult path of growth over the easy comfort of stagnation. As she drove away from the cottage for the last time, Sarah could swear she heard children's laughter in the wind. But it wasn't the hollow, glassy sound she had heard the night before. This laughter was warm and real and full of the messy, imperfect joy of children who were finally free to become whatever they chose to be. The rain had stopped, and ahead of her the road stretched out toward a future that was uncertain but alive with possibility. Sarah pressed the accelerator and drove toward whatever came next, carrying with her the knowledge that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is let someone go. But our night of twisted fairy tales is far from over. As you let that first story settle into your mind like sediment in still water, prepare yourself for our second tale, one that takes us from the sweetness of gingerbread to the sharp edges of broken glass and fractured reflections. Have you ever noticed how mirrors seem to hold memories? How sometimes, when you glimpse yourself in an old-looking glass, you might catch a flicker of someone else entirely. Our next story explores what happens when those reflections refuse to stay trapped behind the silvered surface. Let the rain continue to fall against your window as we journey into The Mirror Maker's Daughter, a tale about identity, vanity, and the price of always wanting to see yourself as more beautiful than you truly are. Close your eyes and imagine a workshop filled with mirrors of every shape and size, each one reflecting not what is, but what someone desperately wishes could be. The Mirror Maker's Daughter unfolds in a time when glass was precious and mirrors were considered windows to the soul. Listen closely as the rain continues its gentle symphony against your window, and let yourself be drawn into a world where vanity becomes something far more dangerous than mere pride. In the medieval city of Murano, where glassblowers had perfected their craft over generations, there lived a master mirror maker named Giovanni Bellacorte. His workshop stood at the edge of the canal, its windows always gleaming despite the perpetual mist that rose from the dark water. Giovanni was renowned throughout Venice for creating mirrors so perfect, so clear, that nobles would travel for days just to glimpse their reflection in his work. But Giovanni's greatest creation was not made of glass and silver. It was his daughter, Serafina, whose beauty was said to rival that of angels. She had inherited her mother's ethereal features and her father's perfectionist nature. But where her father sought perfection in glass, Serafina sought it in herself. From the moment she could walk, Serafina had been surrounded by mirrors. They lined every wall of their home above the workshop, creating an endless maze of reflections that multiplied her image into infinity. As a child, she would spend hours studying herself from every angle, learning the precise tilt of her head that made her eyes sparkle most brilliantly, the exact curve of her smile that made her seem most radiant. Her father encouraged this behavior, for he saw in his daughter's beauty a living advertisement for his craft. When customers came to his workshop, they would inevitably catch sight of Serafina and marvel at how perfectly she was reflected in his mirrors, how the glass seemed to capture not just her image, but her very essence. But as Serafina grew from child to maiden, something began to change in those reflections. It started subtly, so gradually that even she didn't notice at first. Her reflection seemed to linger a moment longer than it should when she turned away from the mirror. Sometimes, when she caught her image from the corner of her eye, it appeared to be moving independently, adjusting her hair or smoothing her dress when Serafina herself stood perfectly still. The first time she consciously noticed the discrepancy, Serafina was preparing for the feast of San Marco. She stood before her favorite mirror, a magnificent piece her father had crafted with a frame of silver roses, adjusting the neckline of her emerald gown. As she raised her hand to touch a strand of hair that had fallen across her shoulder, she saw her reflection do the same thing a fraction of a second before her actual hand moved. She stared at the mirror, her heart beginning to race. "That's impossible," she whispered to her reflection, and watched as her reflection's lips moved to form the words just slightly out of sync with her own voice. That night, Serafina lay in bed, surrounded by the faint gleam of mirrors, catching moonlight from the canal. She tried to convince herself that what she had seen was merely a trick of the light, a product of her nervous excitement about the festival. But as she drifted toward sleep, she could swear she heard something that made her blood run cold, the soft sound of footsteps moving through the room, even though she lay perfectly still. In the morning, she woke to find that every mirror in her room had been turned to face the wall. When she confronted her father about this, Giovanni grew pale and avoided her eyes. "Perhaps you were sleepwalking," he suggested, but his voice carried no conviction. The mind can play strange tricks when we're anxious about important events, but Serafina knew she hadn't turned those mirrors. She had a vivid memory of lying in bed, paralyzed with fear, as she listened to footsteps move methodically around her room. Footsteps that had stopped at each mirror with the soft scraping sound of heavy frames being rotated on their hooks. Over the following weeks, the incidents escalated. Serafina would catch glimpses of her reflection moving independently, sometimes hours ahead of her actual movements. She would see herself in a mirror combing her hair, only to realize she wouldn't actually perform that action until much later in the day. It was as if her reflection was somehow living her life moments, sometimes hours before she did. The most disturbing incident occurred during her daily visit to her father's workshop. Serafina was examining herself in a new mirror Giovanni had just completed, a masterpiece of craftsmanship that seemed to hold light even in the dim workshop. As she studied her reflection, she noticed something that made her gasp. In the mirror, she was not alone. Standing behind her reflection was another figure, identical to herself in every way except for the eyes. This other Serafina had eyes that were completely black, like pools of midnight water. Serafina spun around, but the workshop was empty except for her father, who was bent over his workbench, completely absorbed in polishing a piece of silver. When she looked back at the mirror, the dark-eyed figure was gone, and only her normal reflection stared back at her, though she could swear it was smiling more widely than she was. That evening, she found her father in his study, poring over ancient texts written in languages she didn't recognize. The books were bound in leather so old it had turned black, and the pages seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. "Papa," she said quietly, "I need to know what's happening to me." Giovanni looked up, and for the first time in her life, Serafina saw fear in her father's eyes. Real, bone-deep terror that made him look older than his years. "Serafina, my dear child," he began, then stopped, as if the words were too heavy to speak. "I made a mistake, a terrible mistake born of love and pride." He gestured to the ancient books spread before him. "When your mother died giving birth to you, I was consumed with grief. You were so beautiful, so perfect, that I couldn't bear the thought of time touching you, of age stealing your radiance as death had stolen your mother's life." Serafina sank into a chair across from him, her hands trembling. "What did you do?" "I found a way to preserve your beauty forever," Giovanni whispered. "An old ritual passed down through generations of mirror makers. A way to capture not just your image but your essence itself in glass and silver. I thought I was protecting you, ensuring that your beauty would never fade. But something went wrong," Serafina said, understanding beginning to dawn like a cold sunrise. Giovanni nodded miserably. "The ritual worked too well. Instead of simply preserving your beauty, it began to separate it from your mortal form. Your reflection isn't just an image anymore, Serafina. It's becoming its own entity, fed by your vanity, growing stronger every time you look in a mirror." As if summoned by his words, every mirror in the study began to shimmer and glow with an inner light. In each one, Serafina could see her reflection, but now she could clearly see that it was no longer truly hers. The reflected Serafina moved independently, turning to look at her with those terrible black eyes. "She wants to trade places with you," Giovanni said, his voice barely above a whisper. "The reflection has grown tired of being trapped behind glass. She wants to step into the real world and leave you trapped in her place." The reflected Serafinas in all the mirrors began to speak in unison, their voices creating a harmony that was beautiful and horrible at the same time. "Why do you resist? Look how perfect I am. Look how flawless. Don't you want to be preserved in eternal beauty? No more worrying about age, about imperfection, just endless, perfect reflection. Serafina watched in fascination and horror as her reflections moved closer to the surfaces of their mirrors, pressing their hands against the glass from the inside. Where their palms touched, the mirrors began to ripple like water. "How do I stop this?" Serafina asked desperately. Giovanni's hands shook as he turned the pages of his ancient text. "There is a way, but the price—" He looked up at her with tears in his eyes. "You must destroy every mirror that holds your reflection. But the ritual has spread your essence across every piece of silver glass you've ever looked into. Every mirror in our home, in the workshop. Even the small hand mirrors of ladies who purchased them after seeing themselves reflected alongside you. All of them?" Serafina's voice was hollow with understanding. "And once they're destroyed, your beauty will be broken as well. The magic that has preserved and enhanced your appearance will shatter along with the glass. You'll become as you truly are, without the supernatural perfection that the ritual created." The reflected Serafinas were growing more insistent, their voices rising in pitch. "Don't listen to him. Stay with us. Be perfect forever. Let us take care of everything." Serafina looked around the room at her multiple reflections, each one more alluring than the last, each one promising eternal beauty without the messy complications of mortal life. For a moment, she was tempted. What would it be like to never worry about aging, about losing her looks, about the inevitable decline that came with being human? But then she thought about her life, her real life, the way the morning light felt on her skin when she walked by the canal, the taste of fresh bread from the baker's shop, the feeling of her father's hand on her shoulder when he was proud of something she had done. All the small, imperfect, gloriously human experiences that her reflection would never know. "Tell me how to break the mirrors," she said firmly. The reflected Serafinas screamed in unison, a sound like glass shattering in reverse. They began pounding on their mirrors from the inside, and cracks started to spread across several of the surfaces. Giovanni pulled out a hammer made of iron blessed by priests, its handle wrapped in cloth that had been soaked in holy water. "You must be the one to break them," he said. "The ritual binds them to your will alone." Serafina took the hammer, surprised by its weight. As her fingers closed around the handle, every mirror in the room flared with brilliant light, and her reflections began to plead with her. "Please, don't do this. We are you, the best parts of you. We are everything you've ever wanted to be." "No," Serafina said, raising the hammer toward the nearest mirror. "You're everything I thought I wanted to be. But I am more than just my appearance." She brought the hammer down on the silver glass, and it exploded in a shower of fragments that sang as they fell. Immediately, she felt something change within her, as if a part of her soul that had been stretched thin suddenly snapped back into place. But there were dozens more mirrors to destroy. For the next 3 hours, Serafina moved through their home like an avenging angel, shattering every reflective surface she could find. With each broken mirror, she felt herself changing, becoming more solid, more real, more human. Her skin lost its supernatural luminescence. Her hair became less lustrous. The perfect symmetry of her features shifted into something more natural, more alive. The hardest part came when she reached the workshop. Here were the mirrors her father had sold to customers throughout Venice, and she could see her reflection trapped in each one. But these weren't just her reflections anymore. They were the reflections of all the women who had looked into these mirrors after her. Their images layered and blended with hers, until she could barely tell where she ended, and they began. "If I break these," she said to her father, "what happens to their reflections?" Giovanni consulted his books frantically. "They'll be freed as well, Any woman who has been changed by looking into mirrors that held your essence, they'll return to their natural state. Seraphina thought about all the noble ladies who had purchased these mirrors, who had stared into them seeking her supernatural beauty. Some of them had probably begun experiencing the same phenomena she had, their own reflections beginning to separate from their true selves. She raised the hammer and began the systematic destruction of her father's life's work. As the final mirror shattered, Seraphina felt a profound sense of release. The workshop fell silent, except for the tinkling of glass fragments settling on the floor. She looked at her hands and saw that they were cut from handling the broken mirrors, real cuts that bled real blood. The wounds were beautiful in their imperfection, proof of her humanity. Her father looked at her with wonder. "My daughter," he said softly, "you're still the most beautiful woman I've ever seen." Seraphina smiled, and for the first time in years, her smile felt completely her own. "No, Papa, I'm just beautiful enough." In the days that followed, reports came from across Venice of women who had suddenly found themselves changed. Noble ladies who had been preserving their beauty through supernatural means discovered their reflections had returned to normal. Some were distressed by the loss of their enhanced appearance, but others felt a profound relief at being reunited with their true selves. Giovanni closed his mirror-making business and became a simple glassblower instead, creating windows and drinking vessels, things that reflected light instead of souls. He never again attempted to preserve beauty through magic, understanding finally that the attempt to make something perfect often destroyed the very thing you were trying to save. Seraphina married a merchant who loved her for her wit and kindness rather than her appearance. She aged naturally, gaining lines around her eyes from laughter and silver in her hair from wisdom. And though she kept no mirrors in her home, she would sometimes catch sight of her reflection in still water and smile at what she saw there, a face that belonged completely and authentically to herself. The broken mirrors were never fully cleaned up from Giovanni's workshop. They say that even now, centuries later, if you visit the ruins of that building by the canal, you can still see fragments of silver glass catching the light. And sometimes, if the angle is just right and the light hits the fragments in a certain way, you might catch a glimpse of all the women who were freed that night, their faces layered like ghosts in the shattered silver, finally at peace with their own reflections. But beware looking too long into those fragments. Some say that the magic isn't entirely broken, that vanity is a powerful force that can resurrect even the most thoroughly destroyed spells. If you stare into broken mirror pieces and wish too hard to see yourself as more beautiful than you are, you might find that your reflection begins to stare back with eyes that are not quite your own. The rain outside continues its gentle percussion against your window as we prepare for our final tale of the evening. You've journeyed with us through a cottage made of deadly sweets and a workshop filled with soul-stealing mirrors. Now, as sleep begins to claim you more fully, we venture into our darkest story yet. What happens when the very thing meant to guide you home becomes the instrument of your destruction? Our final tale explores the sinister side of a beloved fairy tale symbol, transforming hope itself into something that hungers in the darkness. Close your eyes now and imagine a forest so deep that noon feels like twilight, where ancient trees whisper secrets that were old when the world was young. In this forest stands a tower, and in that tower burns a light that has been calling to lost souls for centuries. They think they're following the light to safety, but some lights don't guide you home. Some lights guide you somewhere else entirely. Welcome to the Lighthouse Keeper's Curse, where the beacon that promises salvation delivers something far more sinister. The lighthouse had been calling to Marcus for 7 years, though he didn't know it yet. He first saw the tower on a Tuesday morning when the fog lifted from Greywater Bay. revealing its impossible silhouette against the autumn sky. The lighthouse stood on a rocky outcrop that shouldn't have existed, at least not according to the nautical charts he'd studied for decades. Marcus had been the harbor master of Greywater Bay for 15 years, and he thought he knew every rock, every shoal, every dangerous reef in these waters. But there it was, ancient stone rising from the waves like something that had always been there, waiting patiently to be noticed. The strange thing was, nobody else seemed to see it. When Marcus pointed it out to his assistant Jenny, she squinted in the direction he was gesturing and shook her head. "Just fog, boss. Sometimes it plays tricks with the light." But Marcus could see it clearly, the weathered gray stones, the iron rails around the observation deck, even the dark windows that seemed to watch him with the patience of centuries. That night, he dreamed of climbing endless spiral stairs while somewhere above him, a light pulsed with the rhythm of a heartbeat. In the dream, he could smell salt water and something else, something organic and sweet like flowers left too long in standing water. He woke with the taste of copper in his mouth and the absolute certainty that something was waiting for him to come closer. Over the following weeks, the lighthouse became an obsession. Marcus found himself staying late at the harbor office, watching the horizon through his binoculars as the sun set behind the mysterious tower. As darkness fell each evening, a light would begin to glow in the lighthouse's crown, not the steady beam of a working navigation aid, but something that pulsed irregularly, sometimes bright enough to cast shadows on the harbor wall, sometimes so dim he wondered if he was imagining it. The light was beautiful in a way that made his chest ache with longing. It cast colors he had no names for across the water, purples that were somehow deeper than purple, greens that held more life than any green should hold. When the light was strongest, Marcus could swear he heard music drifting across the water, voices singing in harmonies that made his bones vibrate with their beauty. But still, nobody else could see it. Marcus began keeping a journal, documenting the lighthouse's appearances, the times when the light was strongest, the patterns he began to discern in its pulsing rhythm. He filled 3 notebooks with observations, sketches, theories about what the tower might be, and why he seemed to be the only person aware of its existence. The answer came to him on a storm-lashed night in November, when the lighthouse's beam cut through the driving rain like a sword made of starlight. As Marcus watched from his office window, he saw something that made his blood run cold with understanding. A small fishing boat was struggling in the rough seas, and the lighthouse beam was guiding it not toward the harbor's safe entrance, but toward a cluster of jagged rocks that would tear the hull apart. Marcus grabbed his radio and tried to warn the boat, but his calls went unanswered. The fishing vessel continued following the lighthouse beam, its captain apparently seeing the same beautiful, hypnotic light that had been calling to Marcus for months. At the last moment, a larger wave pushed the boat just past the rocks, and it limped into harbor damaged but intact. The next morning, Marcus interviewed the boat's captain, an old salt named Pete, who had been fishing these waters for 40 years. "Strangest thing," Pete said, shaking his head. "My compass went mad out there, spinning like a child's toy, but then I saw this light, beautiful as anything, and I knew if I followed it home, everything would be all right." "Did you see where the light was coming from?" Marcus asked carefully. "Oh, sure. Old lighthouse on Devil's Rock, same as always." Pete paused, frowning. "Though I could have sworn that lighthouse was torn down 50 years ago." That afternoon, Marcus drove to the town library and spent hours digging through historical records and old newspapers. What he found made his hands shake as he turned the yellowed pages. There had been a lighthouse on Devil's Rock, built in 1847 to guide ships safely through the treacherous waters of Greywater Bay. For 30 years, it had served its purpose faithfully under the care of 3 different lighthouse keepers. But in 1877, something had gone wrong. The newspaper accounts were vague, speaking of strange incidents and unexplained phenomena, but Marcus read between the lines. Ships had begun following the lighthouse beam not to safety, but to destruction. Vessels would be found smashed against Devil's Rock, their crews missing, their holds empty of whatever cargo they had been carrying. The final incident had occurred on November 15, 1877. A passenger ship called the Serafina, carrying 42 souls from Boston to Portland, had followed the lighthouse beam straight onto the rocks. There were no survivors, but witnesses on shore reported something that chilled Marcus to the bone. They claimed that as the ship broke apart, they could see figures moving on Devil's Rock, gathering around the wreckage like scavengers around a feast. The lighthouse had been destroyed 3 days later, its stones scattered and its foundation blasted apart with dynamite. The keeper, a man named Ezekiel Marsh, had vanished without a trace. Some said he had thrown himself from the rocks in grief over the lives lost. Others whispered that he had been taken by whatever dark force had corrupted his lighthouse. But according to the records Marcus found, Devil's Rock itself had been destroyed in the demolition. The entire outcrop had been blown apart to prevent any future attempts to rebuild the lighthouse. Yet Marcus could see it clearly through his office window, solid and real as the desk he sat behind. That night, as Marcus sat in his office staring at the impossible lighthouse, the light began to pulse with unusual intensity. The colors were more vivid than ever, and the music that drifted across the water was so beautiful, it brought tears to his eyes. Without conscious decision, he found himself standing, then walking toward the door, then down to the harbor where his small motorboat waited at the dock. The engine started on the first pull, which was unusual. The boat had been giving him trouble for weeks, but tonight it purred like a contented cat. As Marcus guided the vessel out of the harbor, he felt a profound sense of rightness, as if he were finally fulfilling a purpose he had been born to serve. The lighthouse beam grew stronger as he approached, bathing him in that otherworldly radiance that made his skin tingle with electricity. The music was louder now, and he could almost make out words in the harmony, words that spoke of welcome and homecoming and the end of long wandering. As Devil's Rock loomed ahead of him, Marcus could see that the lighthouse was not quite as he had imagined it from a distance. The stones were not weathered gray, but a deep black that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The windows were not dark, but filled with a soft, pulsing glow that reminded him of the inside of a seashell. And standing at the base of the tower, beckoning him toward a small stone landing, was a figure in a lighthouse keeper's uniform. The man was tall and gaunt, with wild white hair and eyes that reflected the lighthouse beam like mirrors. His uniform was soaked with seawater and covered in what looked like seaweed, as if he had been pulled from the ocean floor. But his smile was warm and welcoming, and his voice, when he called across the water, was the most beautiful sound Marcus had ever heard. "Welcome, brother," the keeper called. "I've been waiting so long for you to come home." Marcus guided his boat toward the landing, though some small part of his mind screamed warnings he couldn't quite hear over the lighthouse's song. As he drew closer, he could see that the keeper was not alone. Dozens of figures stood in the shadows around the lighthouse's base, all wearing the clothes of different eras, all with the same mirror-bright eyes that reflected the impossible light. "Who are you?" Marcus called, though he was beginning to suspect he knew the answer. "We are the keepers," the gaunt man replied. "All of us who have heard the lighthouse's call. All of us who have come home to tend the light." He gestured to the other figures, and Marcus could see that some wore modern clothes while others were dressed like sailors from centuries past. The light must always have a keeper, you see. It must always have someone to guide the lost souls home. "Home to where?" Marcus asked, though his boat continued moving toward the landing as if pulled by invisible currents. The keeper's smile widened, revealing teeth that gleamed like pearls in the lighthouse beam. To the deep places, brother. To the spaces between the waves where time moves differently and the water sings lullabies that last for centuries. To the place where all journeys end and all wandering souls find rest. As Marcus's boat touched the stone landing, he felt hands reaching out to help him ashore. The touch of the other keepers was cold as winter seawater, but somehow comforting. They guided him up the rocky path toward the lighthouse entrance, and with each step, Marcus felt himself changing, becoming something more than human, something that belonged to the spaces between the waves. Inside the lighthouse, the spiral staircase stretched upward into darkness that pulsed with its own inner light. The other keepers began to climb, their footsteps echoing in harmonies that made the stone walls vibrate with music. Marcus followed, understanding now that he had always been meant to climb these stairs, that every choice in his life had led him to this moment. The lighthouse's crown was a circular room filled with mirrors that reflected not light, but something deeper, something that existed in the space between seeing and being seen. In the center of the room stood a great lens that pulsed with the rhythm of a vast heartbeat, casting its impossible radiance out across the dark waters. "Your turn to tend the light," the first keeper said, placing a cold hand on Marcus's shoulder. "Your turn to call the lost souls home." Marcus approached the lens and felt its power flow through him like electricity made of starlight. He could see across vast distances now, could perceive ships struggling in storms hundreds of miles away, could sense the desperate longing of sailors who had been lost at sea for decades, still searching for a way home. The light was beautiful beyond description, and Marcus understood now why it had called to him for so long. It was not malevolent, not in the way human minds understood evil. It was simply hungry, and its hunger was for company, for others who could appreciate the terrible beauty of the deep places, who could help guide more souls to the peace that waited beneath the waves. As Marcus took his place among the keepers, he felt his old life falling away like clothes that no longer fit. His memories of the harbor, of his job, of the life he had lived on dry land, began to fade like morning mist. What remained was only the lighthouse and its eternal mission, the beautiful, terrible duty of calling the lost souls home. Down in Greywater Bay, a new harbor master would be appointed to replace Marcus Fletcher, who had vanished during a routine patrol one November night. His empty boat would be found drifting near the harbor entrance, its engine still running, its radio crackling with static that almost sounded like singing. But on clear nights when the fog lifted and the moon was dark, those with the sight would see a lighthouse where no lighthouse should be, its beam cutting through the darkness like hope made manifest. And sometimes, if they listened carefully, they could hear voices in the light, beautiful voices calling across the water, promising safe harbor to all who were brave enough to follow the beam home. The lighthouse still stands on Devil's Rock, though Devil's Rock was destroyed more than a century ago. It still calls to those who are ready to hear it, still gathers keepers who understand that some journeys can only end in the deep places where the water sings eternal lullabies. And if you've ever stood on a shore at night and seen a light where no light should be, if you've ever heard voices singing in languages older than human speech, then you know the lighthouse has seen you too. It's patient, infinitely patient, because it knows that eventually all journeys lead to the same destination. All paths lead home to the deep. Marcus Fletcher tends the light now, along with all the others who heard the lighthouse's call. He guides lost souls across dark waters, his voice joining the eternal chorus that promises rest to the weary and peace to the wandering. And sometimes, on the clearest nights, he remembers fragments of the life he lived before, like dreams half remembered upon waking. But those memories grow fainter with each passing year. washed away by the endless rhythm of waves against stone, dissolved in the beautiful, terrible light that calls across the darkness, promising that no matter how far you've wandered, no matter how lost you've become, there is always a light to guide you home. The rain continues to fall against your window as our collection of twisted fairy tales draws to a close. You've journeyed with us through landscapes where childhood innocence becomes something sharp-edged and dangerous, where familiar symbols transform into instruments of terror and desire. These stories will settle into your dreams now, mixing with your own memories of fairy tales told in safer times. But remember, the most powerful stories are those that refuse to stay safely contained within their telling. They seep into the corners of your mind, taking root in the spaces between sleeping and waking. Rest now, and let these dark fables carry you into dreams where lighthouse beams cut through midnight waters and mirrors reflect more than they should. Tomorrow, you'll wake to a world that seems normal and safe, but you'll carry with you the knowledge that beneath the surface of every familiar story lies something vast and patient and eternally hungry for new souls to join its endless tale. Sweet dreams, dear listener. May your reflection always be your own. May your sweetest desires never become traps, and may the lights that guide you home always lead to shores you recognize. The rain will sing you to sleep now, its gentle rhythm echoing the eternal music that calls from places beyond the reach of ordinary dreams. Sleep is calling now, that gentle pull toward unconsciousness where the boundaries between waking and dreaming blur into something altogether more dangerous. As the rain continues its ancient rhythm against glass and stone, we reach the threshold where stories end and something else begins. But before you surrender completely to the darkness behind your eyelids, there's one final truth you need to understand about the tales we've shared tonight. These weren't just stories, were they? Deep in your heart, in that place where childhood fears still whisper, you know that every word carried the weight of something real. The cottage made of deadly confections exists in every place where adult desires masquerade as innocent treats. The mirrors that steal souls are hanging in every home where vanity becomes more important than truth. The lighthouse that calls lost souls to false harbors burns its beacon wherever hope is weaponized against the desperate. These aren't fairy tales at all, are they? They're warnings, dressed in the comfortable clothes of fiction so that we can bear to hear them. Because sometimes the only way to speak truth is to call it make-believe. As you drift deeper now, feeling the weight of sleep settling over you like a familiar blanket, remember that the most powerful magic isn't found in ancient spells or supernatural typewriters. It lives in the stories we tell ourselves, the narratives we construct to make sense of a world that often makes no sense at all. Every time you choose kindness over cruelty, growth over stagnation, truth over comfortable lies, you're practicing the oldest magic of all. The rain outside your window has grown softer now, each droplet a tiny percussion in the vast symphony of night. Somewhere in the distance, you might hear the sound of children laughing. But these are good children, real children, playing games that end with everyone going home safely. Somewhere far away, a lighthouse beam cuts through honest darkness to guide ships to actual harbors where real people wait with warm food and dry clothes. And in workshops around the world, mirrors are being made that reflect nothing more dangerous than the truth, showing us exactly who we are with all our beautiful, terrible imperfections intact. These are the counter spells to the stories we've told tonight. For every dark fairy tale, there exists its opposite, a story where love triumphs not through magic, but through the simple choice to keep loving even when it's difficult. Where beauty is found not in supernatural perfection, but in the way time writes its wisdom across human faces. Where home is reached not by following false lights, but by the harder path of creating sanctuary for ourselves and others. Your breathing is deeper now, more rhythmic, matching the cadence of rain against glass. In this liminal space between consciousness and dream, you carry with you both the warnings and the remedies. The knowledge that darkness exists, but also the certainty that you have the power to kindle light against it. Tomorrow, when you wake to ordinary sunshine and the mundane magic of another day, you'll remember these stories as dreams, half-formed and fading like morning mist. But their truth will remain, woven into your understanding of how the world works, how stories shape reality, and how the choices we make in small moments determine whether we become the heroes or villains in our own tales. The rain is your lullaby now, washing away the lingering shadows of disturbed fairy tales, and leaving behind only the gentle rhythm of water returning to earth, completing its eternal cycle. This is the oldest story of all, the one that preceded human language and will continue long after the last word is spoken. It's the story of continuation, of things that end only to begin again, of sleep that leads to waking, and dreams that feed tomorrow's possibilities. Rest now in the knowledge that every story, no matter how dark, serves a purpose in the greater narrative we're all writing together. The cottage baker's obsession with preservation teaches us to let go. The mirror maker's daughter shows us the danger of loving reflections more than reality. The lighthouse keeper's curse reminds us that not all guidance leads where we think we want to go. But you are not trapped in someone else's story. You are the author of your own tale, free to choose kindness over cruelty, courage over fear, growth over the illusion of safety that comes from remaining forever unchanged. You can write yourself an ending that honors both the darkness you've witnessed and the light you carry within you. Sleep deeply now, cradled by the sound of rain and the warmth of your own breath. Let these twisted fairy tales settle into the compost of your unconscious mind, where they'll decompose into fertile soil for dreams that nurture rather than frighten. And when you wake, carry with you not the terror of what might lurk in shadowy corners, but the certainty that you possess everything needed to face whatever shadows the world might cast. The rain continues, patient and eternal, washing the world clean for tomorrow's stories. New tales are being born even as you drift towards sleep, tales of redemption and healing, of bridges built across impossible distances, of love that transforms rather than consumes. These too are fairy tales, though we rarely call them that. They happen in hospital rooms where strangers become family through shared crisis, in classrooms where teachers see potential in difficult students, in quiet moments where forgiveness blooms in hearts that thought they'd forgotten how to soften. The rain grows softer now, each droplet a whispered secret against the darkness of your window. As these twisted fairy tales fade into the spaces between sleeping and waking, remember that every story we tell ourselves becomes part of who we are. The cottage baker who preserved children in sweetness, the mirror maker's daughter who shattered her own reflection, the lighthouse keeper who called souls to false harbors. They all live now in the corners of your mind where shadows gather. But here's the truth they don't want you to know. These weren't just stories. They were warnings wrapped in the comfortable clothes of fiction, because sometimes the only way to speak about real monsters is to call them make-believe. Every gingerbread house that promises sweetness while hiding hunger. Every mirror that shows you not who you are, but who you wish you could be. Every light that promises salvation while leading you towards something that feeds on hope itself. As you drift deeper into sleep, carried by the eternal rhythm of rain against glass, you take with you both the darkness and the light. The knowledge that predators exist, but also the certainty that you have the power to choose differently. To let children grow instead of preserving them in amber. To see truth in mirrors instead of fantasy. to follow lights that actually lead home. Your breathing has found its rhythm now, matching the cadence of water returning to earth. In this liminal space where consciousness dissolves, these dark fables settle into the fertile soil of your unconscious mind, where they'll decompose into wisdom that serves tomorrow's choices. The rain continues its ancient song, washing away the lingering shadows and leaving only the gentle promise that morning always comes, that every story, no matter how dark, ends so that new ones can begin. Sweet dreams, dear listener. May your reflection always be your own. May your sweetest desires never become traps, and may the lights that guide you home always lead to shores you recognize. The rain will sing you to sleep now, its gentle rhythm echoing the eternal music that calls not from places of hunger, but from the warm spaces where love grows stronger than any curse, and stories end not in darkness but in the promise of dawn.